Before the lightsabers, before the Death Star, before the billions, there was a young man in Modesto, California, quiet, rebellious, with a camera in his hand and galaxies in his head. George Lucas didn't just create a movie. He built a religion. He took a budget-sized dream and made it the most profitable space opera of all time. This is not just the story of a filmmaker. This is the tale of how one man turned imagination into an empire. Welcome to the story of George Lucas, the architect of a universe. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Hated Rules. George Lucas was born in Modesto, California, in 1944, a quiet farming town that felt galaxies away from fame or fortune. His childhood was steeped in the mundane: old cars, long summers, and a strict father who ran a stationery store and believed in discipline more than dreams. George, however, was a misfit in that world. He wasn't a rebel with a cause. He was a dreamer without a map. He wasn't interested in business or sports like his peers. What fascinated him were machines, fast ones. He fell head over heels for racing cars. By the time he was a teenager, his heart wasn't set on film. It was set on the roar of engines and the blur of speed. He wanted to become a professional race car driver, and he lived for it. Until one moment changed everything. Just days before graduating high school, George was in a terrible car accident. His Fiat Bianchina was completely destroyed after being hit broadside. He barely survived. Doctors said it was a miracle. That near-death experience jolted something in him, like the universe whispering, "There's a different destiny waiting." With racing no longer an option, George drifted. He enrolled at Modesto Junior College, experimenting with photography and anthropology. It was there, behind the lens of a camera, that he finally found something that moved him as fast and as deep as racing ever did: storytelling through visuals. Eventually, he transferred to the University of Southern California's School of Cinematic Arts. At USC, Lucas was surrounded by radical thinkers, tech geeks, and future legends. Film wasn't just entertainment, it was a battlefield of ideas. Here, George found his tribe and began building a new dream, frame by frame. His early student films were experimental, abstract, and far from mainstream. One short in particular, Electronic Labyrinth, THX 1138 4EB, would go on to win awards and catch the attention of Hollywood insiders. George had found his voice: quiet, analytical, and obsessed with control. He wasn't there to entertain. He was there to build worlds. But underneath the rising talent, there was still that boy from Modesto, uncomfortable with authority, distrustful of systems, and constantly battling the expectations of others. What he truly wanted wasn't fame, it was freedom. And that desire? It would go on to shape every decision he made, even if the galaxy wasn't ready for it yet. Chapter 2. The Rebel in Hollywood. By the late 1960s, George Lucas had graduated from USC with a vision unlike any other. He wasn't interested in following the footsteps of traditional filmmakers. He didn't want to make romantic dramas or war epics. He wanted to challenge the system by creating new ones. While most young directors were trying to get inside the Hollywood machine, George was already dreaming of ways to bypass it. His first real test came with THX 1138, a feature-length adaptation of his student short. It was cold, dystopian, cerebral, nothing like what the studios wanted. But with Francis Ford Coppola, his friend and mentor, by his side, Lucas got a shot. Coppola had just founded a small independent studio called American Zoetrope, and he believed in giving filmmakers creative freedom. That belief would be tested hard. Warner Brothers backed THX 1138, but when they saw the finished cut, they panicked. It was too strange, too bleak, too intellectual. The studio re-edited the film without Lucas's permission. For a young director obsessed with control, this was a violation. The film bombed, and the dream of American Zoetrope almost collapsed. George learned a brutal lesson. The industry rewards obedience, not originality. But instead of quitting, Lucas doubled down. He decided to play the Hollywood game, but on his own terms. In 1973, he made American Graffiti, a nostalgic ode to his teenage years. Fast cars, rock and roll, late-night diners. It was everything THX wasn't. And it exploded. Critics loved it. Audiences devoured it. The film cost less than $800,000 to make and earned over $100 million. Suddenly, George Lucas wasn't just some brooding film student. He was a hitmaker. But here's the twist: he didn't celebrate. He retreated. While the world praised him, Lucas was already building something else. Something massive. A science fantasy universe that no studio wanted to touch. He called it the Star Wars. It was risky, absurdly ambitious, and to the suits in Hollywood, it sounded like commercial suicide. But to Lucas, it was freedom, his way of reclaiming control. American Graffiti gave him the leverage, and he used it brilliantly. Instead of asking for a higher director's fee on his next project, Lucas made a strange request. He wanted to retain the merchandising and sequel rights. The studio, thinking the film would flop, agreed. That one deal would change the landscape of cinema and George Lucas's bank account forever. Behind the quiet stare and cautious smile was a visionary planning a cinematic revolution. He had already seen what happened when you let others hold the reins. Now, he was taking them back, one calculated move at a time. Bonus 1. The dream that died in the desert. Before Star Wars, before Indiana Jones, before Lucas became a name whispered in the temples of cinema, there was a dream, one that crashed and burned in the hot California sun. It was called THX 1138. After graduating from USC, George Lucas was fueled by rebellion. He wanted to challenge Hollywood, to burn its rules and build something new. In 1971, with the help of his mentor Francis Ford Coppola and their newly founded company, American Zoetrope, Lucas released THX 1138, a dystopian sci-fi feature that was nothing like the fantasy blockbusters that would later define his legacy. THX 1138 was cold, sterile, and terrifying. A vision of a future where emotions were outlawed, people were drugged into obedience, and identity was erased under a regime of chrome and silence. The film was ambitious, visually arresting, technically brilliant, but it flopped. Critics were intrigued, but the public was bewildered. Warner Brothers, who had financed it, hated it. They even re-edited the film against Lucas's wishes. It was a commercial failure, and worse, it nearly killed Lucas's career before it had even begun. George was crushed. He poured his vision into this film, and Hollywood shrugged. That early failure burned. But in the ashes of THX 1138, something stirred. Something angry. Something determined. George Lucas realized that if he wanted to speak to the masses, he had to change the way he told his stories. He didn't abandon rebellion. He disguised it in myth, wrapped it in spectacle, and hid it inside laser beams and space wizards. THX 1138 didn't succeed, but it taught him how to make the world listen. Sometimes, the story that dies is the one that saves you. Chapter 3. Building a Galaxy. By the mid-1970s, George Lucas was obsessed. He had locked himself in a writing frenzy, attempting to forge a story that merged ancient mythology, space opera, and emotional resonance. The result was the Star Wars, a script that baffled most studios and left executives scratching their heads. Spaceships, desert planets, laser swords, a masked villain with breathing problems? They didn't get it. But Lucas didn't care. He knew what he was building. After countless rejections, 20th Century Fox finally gave him the green light. Barely. They approved a modest budget and, more importantly, left him mostly alone. That was a mistake the studio would never forget. Lucas headed to Tunisia to film the desert world of Tatooine. It was hell. The equipment broke down constantly. Sandstorms destroyed sets. The heat was unbearable. The British crew didn't take him seriously. They saw him as a quiet, American oddball playing make-believe. Lucas grew increasingly stressed and withdrawn. His vision was crumbling before his eyes, but still, he pushed forward. Every shot mattered. Every decision was war. He wasn't just making a movie, he was shaping a universe. And no one around him understood it yet. Back in California, Industrial Light and Magic, Lucas's newly created visual effects company, was struggling to meet deadlines. They had to invent new technology from scratch. Motion control cameras, miniature spaceships, alien prosthetics. This wasn't a movie set, it was a laboratory. And Lucas was their mad scientist. He drained his health, his finances, and nearly his sanity. But he refused to compromise. He had already experienced what it felt like to have someone else butcher his work. This time, it was all or nothing. The first rough cut of Star Wars was a disaster. Executives panicked. Friends called it confusing. One even suggested cutting out the Force entirely. But Lucas didn't flinch. He kept editing, kept refining. And then, something clicked. John Williams' score was added. The pacing tightened. The sound design came alive. And suddenly, the chaotic mess transformed into a mythic adventure. Lucas had done it. He had created something the world had never seen before. Not just a film, but a galaxy. A place with its own rules, its own religion, its own soul. He didn't just build a world for fans. He built a sanctuary for dreamers. When the lights went down at the first screening in 1977, few knew they were witnessing history. But George Lucas did. Because in that moment, his rebellion against the system became something bigger, a new cinematic empire. Chapter 4: The Empire Strikes Gold. When Star Wars hit theaters on May 25, 1977, no one expected the tidal wave that followed. Lines wrapped around blocks. People watched it over and over again. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. Theaters couldn't get enough prints. And just like that, Star Wars wasn't a film, it was a movement. But George Lucas wasn't just celebrating box office numbers. He was watching his business plan unfold. Before the film was released, Lucas made a decision that would go down as one of the smartest in entertainment history. He negotiated to retain all merchandising rights for Star Wars. At the time, the studio laughed. Merchandising? Toys? They didn't care. They gave him full control. Then the toys hit the shelves. Action figures, ships, playsets, lunchboxes, pajamas, toothbrushes. Anything that could hold a logo was turned into a product. And kids went wild. Christmas of 1977 came, and there weren't enough toys to meet demand. Some families received empty boxes with vouchers for figures that would arrive months later. That's how deep the hunger ran. In just a few years, Star Wars merchandise brought in hundreds of millions of dollars. Lucas had built not just a movie, but a licensing empire. And he owned it all. While Hollywood studios were still measuring success in ticket sales, Lucas was redefining what a movie could be, a launchpad for an entire economic ecosystem. But the empire wasn't finished expanding. Lucas began working on sequels. He financed them himself, using the money from merchandising to maintain full creative control. This allowed him to break the mold again with The Empire Strikes Back, a film that took darker, riskier turns, introducing emotional depth, and of course, the now legendary line, "I am your father." Critics were stunned. Sequels weren't supposed to be better than the original. But Lucas, always the outlier, had done it again. He wasn't following Hollywood's playbook. He was burning it. By the time Return of the Jedi landed in 1983, George Lucas had fully weaponized his galaxy. Fans weren't just watching. They were collecting, living, breathing, dressing, dreaming Star Wars. And Lucas, the quiet rebel who had once been dismissed by studios, was now something else entirely. A self-made mogul with an empire of myth and merchandise that no one in Hollywood could touch. Bonus 2. The Man Who Hated Dialogue. For a man who changed the way we tell stories forever, George Lucas had one little problem. He hated writing dialogue. Yes, the creator of the most quoted saga in film history, "May the Force be with you, I am your father, I've got a bad feeling about this," actually despised the act of writing character conversations. In fact, during the early drafts of Star Wars, his dialogue was so stiff and robotic that even his closest friends begged him to let someone else rewrite it. His college buddy and future collaborator, Willard Huyck, once joked, "George could write a spaceship battle like nobody else, but when the characters opened their mouths, it sounded like a malfunctioning droid reading Shakespeare." Lucas focused on visuals, structure, and ideas. He saw cinema as a mythical experience, not just words on a page. The problem? Movies need people to talk, so he relied heavily on others. His wife, Marcia Lucas, was instrumental in reshaping scenes. Screenwriters like Lawrence Kasdan were brought in later to breathe life into wooden lines. Even the actors had to fight the dialogue. Harrison Ford famously told him, "You can type this as asterisk asterisk asterisk, George, but you sure can't say it." Lucas knew it, and he didn't care. He believed dialogue was just another layer of sound. To him, cinema wasn't about words. It was about feelings, rhythm, movement, symbols. In an industry obsessed with clever banter and Oscar-worthy monologues, George Lucas was a silent rebel. He let the visuals talk. And somehow it worked, because when the right music plays, the right ship explodes, and a farm boy stares at twin suns, you don't need words to feel everything. Chapter 5. The mastermind behind the curtain. By the mid-1980s, George Lucas had become a legend, not just in film, but in business. While his name was on every collector's box and every ticket stub, he was stepping further away from the director's chair. What he wanted now was control. Total control, not just over stories, but over technology, production, and the pipeline that made imagination real. Lucas had already built Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, a visual effects company born out of necessity for the original Star Wars. But it didn't stop there. ILM became a powerhouse, setting the new standard in visual effects for Hollywood at large. If a movie had spaceships, explosions, or fantastical worlds, it probably ran through Lucas's machines. But ILM was just the beginning. Lucas saw another missing piece in the film industry: sound. So he created THX, a certification system that ensured films were heard exactly as the creators intended. It wasn't just marketing. It was a technical revolution that forced theaters to improve or be left behind. Lucas wasn't done. In 1986, he sold off a small graphics division from Lucasfilm to Steve Jobs. That little group, it became Pixar. Lucas, almost casually, helped launch the most iconic animation studio of the modern era. His reach extended even when he wasn't trying. Meanwhile, his attention turned inward. Lucas was building Skywalker Ranch, a utopia for filmmakers. It wasn't just an office or a studio. It was a creative haven surrounded by nature, with editing bays, sound mixing rooms, and a sense of peace. No executives, no studio pressure, just storytelling. Through all of this, Lucas became something rare, a visionary who controlled his universe from behind the curtain. He didn't need Hollywood anymore. Hollywood needed him. While others chased trends, Lucas created the tools they would use to chase them. He had reshaped the rules, and he had done it quietly, without the glamour of Oscar speeches or red carpets. He let the work speak, and the work was thunderous. George Lucas had become more than a filmmaker. He was now a builder of industries, a mythmaker with a server room, a dreamer whose dreams needed infrastructure. And so he built it himself. Chapter 6. The Phantom Gamble. After years of building empires from the shadows, George Lucas decided to step back into the spotlight. It had been over a decade since Return of the Jedi, and a generation had grown up with Star Wars etched into their DNA. But George wasn't done with the galaxy. In fact, he wanted to go back to where it all began. In 1999, The Phantom Menace hit theaters. It wasn't just a movie release, it was an event. People camped outside theaters for days, lightsabers in hand, anticipation in their eyes. The prequels had arrived, and with them, George Lucas's return to directing. But this wasn't the Star Wars people remembered. Lucas had embraced a new vision, one powered by CGI, political intrigue, and philosophical themes. The space opera was now a digital epic. While the original trilogy relied on grit and improvisation, this new world was clean, precise, and divisive. Fans didn't know what to make of it. Jar Jar Binks became the face of controversy. Dialogue was stiff. Emotions felt synthetic. But Lucas was unfazed. This was his story, told his way, with the tools he had spent years creating. Technologically, the films were revolutionary. Entire environments were digitally rendered. Characters were motion captured. Cameras were digital, something almost no one in Hollywood dared to use at the time. Lucas wasn't just telling a story. He was dragging the entire industry into the future. Attack of the Clones followed in 2002, then Revenge of the Sith in 2005. The trilogy told a grand story of corruption, fall, and transformation. Anakin Skywalker's descent into Darth Vader was tragic and operatic, but reception remained mixed. For many, the heart and soul of the originals were missing, buried under pixels and exposition. Still, there was something undeniable. The prequels created a new generation of Star Wars fans. Kids who didn't grow up with Luke or Leia now had their own heroes, their own ships, their own saga. Toys flew off shelves. Video games broke records. And memes, lots of memes, kept the prequels alive in internet culture long after the credits rolled. Lucas, for better or worse, had reshaped Star Wars again. And this time, it was permanent. He had gambled everything, his reputation, his legacy, his creative control, to bring his vision full circle. And whether people loved it or hated it, they couldn't ignore it. Chapter 7. The Billion-Dollar Farewell. By the early 2010s, George Lucas had done what few in Hollywood had ever managed. He had created, owned, and controlled the cultural juggernaut. Star Wars wasn't just a movie franchise. It was a religion, a rite of passage, a shared language across generations. And for decades, Lucas had been both its architect and its gatekeeper. But something was changing. After the prequels, Lucas faced a wave of relentless criticism. The same fan base he had once inspired now questioned his every move. Some accused him of ruining their childhoods. Others mocked his creative choices. It wore on him. The spark that had once driven him to expand the universe began to dim. In 2012, Lucas made a decision that shocked the world. He sold Lucasfilm to Disney. The deal was worth over $4 billion, half in cash, half in Disney stock. Just like that, Star Wars had a new owner. The galaxy was no longer his. The sale wasn't only about money. George already had plenty of that. It was about legacy. He wanted the franchise to live on, even if it meant giving up control. He also pledged to donate the majority of the money to educational charities. He once said, "Children are the future. That's where I'm going to spend my money." Behind the scenes, he had developed story treatments for a new trilogy, ideas he hoped would guide the next chapter of Star Wars. But Disney had different plans. They shelved his scripts. When The Force Awakens was released in 2015, Lucas watched from the outside for the first time. It was no longer his universe. It had become a shared universe, reimagined by others. The transition wasn't smooth. George expressed disappointment. He compared the sale to handing over his kids to strangers. It hurt, but he didn't fight it. He had made his choice. In the years that followed, Lucas stayed mostly quiet. He visited sets occasionally, offered advice when asked, but never forced his vision. He retreated to his Skywalker ranch, focusing on family and his true passion, experimental filmmaking and education. In a sense, he had become the Jedi Master he once wrote about, letting go of attachment, passing on what he had learned. The sale of Lucasfilm marked the end of an era, but it also cemented George Lucas as one of the most influential and richest figures in cinematic history. His story was no longer just about creation. It was about transformation, legacy, and knowing when to walk away from the galaxy you built with your bare hands. Chapter 8. Beyond the Stars. After walking away from the galaxy he built, George Lucas didn't vanish. He evolved. No longer bound to the expectations of fans or studios, he entered a quieter, more contemplative phase of his life. But even in silence, his shadow loomed large across the industry. He poured his time and fortune into education and storytelling innovation. His George Lucas Educational Foundation, created long before the Disney deal, gained renewed strength. Through it, he promoted project-based learning, creativity in classrooms, and equal access to resources, trying to spark imagination in the real world the way Star Wars once did in theaters. At the same time, Lucas began to work on smaller, experimental films. Projects with no expectations, no box office pressure. Films made just for the sake of art. He called it his retirement hobby, but to him, it was a return to his roots, a young filmmaker with strange ideas and no limits. His Skywalker Ranch became his sanctuary, a place where stories were still sacred, not commodities. Surrounded by books, art, vintage gear, and the quiet hum of editing machines, Lucas spent his days immersed in the kind of filmmaking that Hollywood rarely greenlights anymore. Despite the industry's constant evolution, George Lucas remained timeless. His influence was felt in every blockbuster, every franchise blueprint, every story universe with prequels, sequels, and spin-offs. Without him, There is no Marvel Cinematic Universe, no Avatar, no multiverse obsession. He didn't just change the rules, he rewrote the playbook. And yet, the man himself never chased celebrity. No late-night shows, no personal brand, no Twitter wars, just stories, ideas, blueprints of wonder. His true wealth wasn't measured in billions, but in galaxies inspired, in imaginations ignited. Today, George Lucas is more than a filmmaker. He is a mythmaker, an architect of modern myth. A quiet giant whose vision stretched beyond screens, beyond generations, beyond the stars. He proved that one person, armed with imagination and persistence, could reshape culture and commerce at once. His life is a reminder that you can sell your company, pass the torch, leave the spotlight. But if your ideas are strong enough, your presence never really fades. George Lucas didn't just make movies. He changed the way the world dreams.